The public inquiry into foreign interference heard once again from the head of Canada's spy agency. Commissioner Marie-Josée Augue recalled CSIS Director David Vigneault to clear up discrepancies after multiple witnesses said they had not been given information about Chinese interference. The CBC's Janice McGregor has the details from Ottawa.
Yeah, this wasn't a complete do-over of all of his testimony from last week. This was narrowly focused on 3 specific documents that warranted kind of more attention than they otherwise would have gotten. These were briefing documents from the fall of 2022 and February of 2023, briefings for the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office about specific incidents of foreign interference. And the question that was raised was whether the information in these documents had been conveyed to their intended recipients in PMO. They contain stark conclusions, warnings, you might call them, about the need for the government to do more to prevent and deter foreign interference. And yet, when the Prime Minister testified and his staff testified, they had suggested that they hadn't actually seen these documents until they were in front of the inquiry, and that this specific sort of information that was highlighted in them wasn't something that had been conveyed in the oral briefings that they had received from CSIS. So how did David Vigneault explain that to us today? Well, he said that, yes, it is possible that he didn't say those exact words because the meetings that were being probed at this inquiry were about very specific issues, specific things happening with particular countries. And they might not have gotten into the more kind of general or stark conclusions that people were focused on with these documents. Here's how he explained what these oral briefings can be like sometimes in terms of whether or not they kind of stick to the script.
It's not extraordinary to go to a briefing having material and having prepared yourself to discuss a topic, and it's something completely different that happens to be discussed. So that's when I joke with my staff that I bring my briefing material and I bring my hockey skates, because you have to be able to be very agile on dealing with any issues that the person you're briefing wants to raise with you.
He described a more sophisticated or complex ecosystem of information where sometimes things would be written down, conveyed on paper ahead of a briefing or as a follow-up to a briefing. Sometimes things would only be communicated orally, all of it very case by case, specific to the speed with which they had to turn things around and also the urgency of the issue at hand. So that is a caution to all of us seeing briefing documents to never assume that sort of there was exactly sort of conveyed what is written on the page. Nevertheless, though, Vigneault also reminded us that if we've been following his public statements on foreign interference, a lot of the sharper lines in these documents have actually been conveyed in other ways, both kind of publicly from him as the head of CSIS, but he said also privately as well in his various conversations. And some of the lines that appear more than once in these documents, he said were a sign that sort of his staff kind of know that these are main points that he makes again and again and again to the government. I want to talk about, though, something that, frankly, over the last couple of days has become a bit of a thing in Ottawa. With respect to these documents, there was a line in the evidence summary from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau where he said he reads them when he can. If he is not able to read the document, he trusts someone else, specifically his National Security Intelligence Advisor, will tell him if there's something important he needs to know. A number of media commentators have leaned into that pretty hard, raised some skeptical eyebrows about that part of Trudeau's evidence at this inquiry. We also had Pierre Poilievre, fair to say, mocking it a little bit in a speech yesterday in Ottawa, this idea that somehow the Prime Minister wouldn't be reading important intelligence information that was prepared for him. Trudeau himself was asked about that at his news conference earlier today, and this is what he said.
I read everything that is put in front of me. A Prime Minister takes in massive amounts of information and reads massive amounts of documents. I expect anything that is of particular high importance or relevance to be elevated, and that's what happens.
Okay, so we've heard this week as well that sometimes CSIS has gotten things wrong. It's been really quite illuminating to see the kind of interactions between the Prime Minister and his staff and intelligence officials. They've gotten pushback from the PEO on what it's been conveying. So how did David Vigneault handle that in his appearance today?
Well, it was quite interesting. After the questions from all the lawyers had concluded, he did ask Commissioner Ugg if it would be possible to make a closing remark. And that remark directly related to what we have been kind of talking about this week, the fairly extraordinary examples brought forward by the Prime Minister and his staff of times where sort of information was put in front of them that they believed was wrong and they challenged it. And in fact, yeah, it wasn't right. Here's what David Vigneault said about that.
Intelligence is a little bit like a puzzle. Sometimes we have a very clear picture of the puzzle. Sometimes, through use of raw intelligence and assess intelligence, we are building that picture. But I think what is important to remember is that this is done by professional, trained intelligence analysts and professionals that are bringing this together.
There continue to be questions about whether Justin Trudeau's government is doing enough with the warnings it is receiving from the spy agency. Justin Trudeau today was asked whether he still has trust in David Vigneault, the head of the spy agency, and Trudeau replied that he has tremendous trust in Canada's intelligence agencies plural, I guess he means, writ large, because everyone has important work to do to keep Canadians safe. But he also acknowledged there's a lot more for all of them to do.
That is the CBC's Janice McGregor in Ottawa. The Chinese embassy in Canada released a statement expressing its firm opposition to accusations made by Prime Minister Trudeau earlier this week. The embassy said that some politicians in Canada, driven by their own self-interests, are attempting to target China in the public inquiry. The statement goes on to say that the testimonies have been characterized with terms like highly likely, probable, and suspicious, but they fail to provide any substantial evidence. China says it is strongly urging Canada to respect the facts, abandon ideological biases, stop hyping up the lies, and stop poisoning the atmosphere of China-Canada relations. Otherwise, Canada could be at risk of suffering the consequences of its actions. For more on the inquiry, I want to bring in Michael Kempa. He is Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Ottawa. Michael, nice to see you. I know you've been watching the inquiry closely. What do you think about what you've seen so far?
It's unfolded in a lot of the ways that we would have expected, in that a lot of the material obviously cannot be discussed in a public capacity. It's been reviewed in camera behind closed doors by Justice Ogue, who will be ultimately leaning on the agencies producing that information to give summaries to the public. So what I would say is, it's looking very good so far. We've learned quite a lot over the last couple of weeks. The real value of it will be how exactly are those more top secret materials dealt with. I think we may get some good summaries down the line.
The head of CSIS was back in the hot seat for a second time after witnesses stated they had not been briefed on Chinese interference. And the director didn't back down, saying he's extremely proud of the agency despite some of the doubts. Do you think CSIS, Canada's national security specialist, did enough here?
So it seems when you look at the documents, the opening parts of the documents that have some of the stronger statements, the existential crisis facing Canada, for example, the need to develop consequences for foreign interference to dissuade people, other states, from engaging in it. These are very often in the sort of preamble statements that Mr. Vigneault is right, probably would not have been the focus of discussions where they dial down into detail specific cases right away when they're briefing either the Prime Minister or his ministers or inner circle. What I would say is, though, as well, Mr. Vigneault is right. CSIS has made many of those broader statements in a public capacity, in their public reports. So there shouldn't really be anything that was that surprising to those ministers in question. Justin Trudeau himself was pretty candid that he's had a fairly extensive set of briefings on the part of CSIS.
When we heard Trudeau testify before the commission, what stood out to you?
I think the main thing was, after a year of almost total silence on the foreign interference file, where the Prime Minister really wouldn't even say if he had been briefed at all by CSIS or any of his people, he suddenly sort of opened up on the stand and under oath, where he walked Canadians through very clearly what information he had been given at different times and what exactly the thought process or decision-making process of the government was. So just for example, when we talk about the controversial nomination of Han Dong in the north end of Toronto, Don Valley North, Mr. Trudeau said, look, my advisor, Mr. Broadhurst, told me they had concerns. The concerns were not especially well corroborated. I asked if Mr. Dong was a witting participant. We had no information to indicate that he was. I asked if it looked like it could have impacted the outcome of the nomination. The vote was too wide a margin. And therefore, if there was a problem, it hadn't been that impactful. So we didn't do anything in terms of pulling the plug on that nomination. In other words, he walked us through how he was thinking at that time for the first time ever.
Do you think that the Prime Minister and others have thrown David Vigneault under the bus in the sense of saying, you know, at times we got intelligence from security officials, from intelligence officials, and the intelligence was wrong. And so we pushed back and it ended up being wrong, that this kind of came out. Does this show, what do you think this shows?
I think that actually shows the normal pattern of the production and consumption of intelligence between an intelligence agency like CSIS in Canada or the CIA in the United States and the government members that consume and interrogate that intelligence. It's very much a back and forth process, and it should be. I think the tone at the time of the inquiry did sound a little accusatory on the part of some ministers, saying, well, you know, we can't trust everything we hear and we've learned to be skeptical. But I would say I would rather have heard it to say, well, as would be normal, we push back and question the facts because intelligence comes from things like human sources, informants. Informants are not always telling the truth. So if government members have information that would challenge what informants have to say, they would share that with CSIS, and there would be that kind of back and forth between government and its intelligence agency in pushing forward what CSIS would then look into on the ground. I didn't like the tone as much. I think it would be better to explain to Canadians that that back and forth is normal, and there's no need to throw Mr. Vigneault or anybody else under the bus.
And then just finally, what do you make of some of how China, the Chinese embassy in Canada, has reacted? You know, they use words like highly likely, probable, suspicious, strongly urging Canada to respect the facts or basically suffer the consequences. What do you make of that kind of reaction?
Well, I think we've already suffered the consequences in that there's well-documented interference in our political process. So if China or any other foreign state would expect that Canada or any of its Five Eyes partners in the Western democracies would tolerate interference without bringing it to the attention of their population, I don't know why they would possibly have that expectation. It would be any hostile state's preference to have an undereducated public that's unaware of the reality of foreign interference. So they must say something now, and obviously to say nothing would be to basically admit that they've engaged in all of these activities. But I don't think we should be too fearful of consequences beyond what we've already continued to endure.
Michael, great to talk to you as always. Michael Kempa is the Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Ottawa.